Most people think a crash happens at the moment of impact, but as a risk consultant, I know the truth. The collapse begins years before, in the silent cracks no one bothers to fix. When I signed the papers that morning, I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was closing a file on a high-risk asset that had finally reached zero value. My husband thought he was evicting a quiet shadow from his house. He had no idea he was actually being locked out of his own kingdom. The snow fell outside the window, thick and heavy, swallowing the gray skyline of the city. Inside the penthouse, the silence was even heavier. It was a sterile, expensive silence, the kind that only money and a lack of love can buy. Evelyn Hartwell sat at the mahogany dining table. Her back was straight, her hands resting calmly on the cold surface. At 60, her face was a map of disciplined emotions. Years of analyzing corporate failures had taught her one thing: never let your opponents see your pulse. Across from her sat Richard Caldwell. At 55, he was at the peak of his visible power. His suit was tailored, his hair perfectly silver at the temples, and his eyes, as always, were fixed on his watch. To Richard, time was a currency, and he felt Evelyn was wasting it. Between them lay a single stack of paper, the divorce agreement. Richard slid a heavy fountain pen across the table. The gold nib caught the dim morning light. "I have a board meeting at 10, Evelyn," Richard said. His voice was brisk, the tone he used for underperforming department heads. "The terms are more than fair. You keep your personal savings, and I've added a transition stipend. It's more than you'd ever make at that boutique firm of yours." Evelyn looked at the pen. She didn't reach for it immediately. She was observing the way Richard's jaw tightened, a classic sign of impatience. In her world, impatience was a liability. It led to overlooked details. "The house?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, like a low-frequency hum. Richard exhaled a sharp, jagged breath. "I need the house for entertaining. The new infrastructure project requires a certain image. You have 30 days to vacate. I've already had my assistant look into some high-end assisted living condos. You'll be comfortable." "Assisted living?" He spoke as if she were a piece of aging machinery being decommissioned. Evelyn picked up the pen. It was heavy, balanced. She felt the weight of 30 years in that grip. 30 years of being the quiet wife. 30 years of Richard assuming her silence was a lack of intelligence rather than a choice to observe. He didn't know that while he was shouting into his cell phone about energy margins, she was in the next room, reading the fine print of the trust laws that governed his very existence. He didn't know that her little job as a risk consultant involved stabilizing the very portfolios that funded his lifestyle. She leaned forward. The movement was fluid, precise. With a single, graceful stroke, she signed her name. Evelyn Hartwell. She didn't use his last name. She hadn't felt like a Caldwell for a long time. "Done," she said, sliding the papers back. Richard snatched the folder. He didn't look at her signature. He only looked at the fact that the task was completed. He stood up, buttoning his blazer, already mentally in the boardroom. 30 days, Evelyn. Don't make this difficult," he said, turning toward the door. "I've instructed the staff to help you pack the essential things. Let's keep this professional." He walked away, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. The heavy front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. Evelyn remained seated. She watched the snow continue to blur the world outside. For the first time in 3 decades, the risk was gone. The liability had walked out the door. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. In fact, her heart rate was a perfect 60 beats per minute. "Professional," she whispered to the empty room. A faint, sharp smile touched the corners of her lips. "Yes, Richard. Let's see how you handle a true professional." The countdown had begun, not for her departure, but for his realization. Evelyn reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. It contained the ledger of a family trust he didn't even know existed. a trust that held 51% of the voting shares in Caldwell Energy and Infrastructure. He thought he was ending a marriage. She was beginning a restructuring. The silence in the penthouse wasn't a sudden intruder. For Evelyn, it had been a permanent, unpaying tenant for the better part of a decade. In her professional life as a risk consultant, silence was a diagnostic signal. When a complex system goes quiet, it is either functioning in perfect harmony or failing at a cellular level. As she sat at the mahogany table where the ink on the divorce papers was still drying, Evelyn closed her eyes and let the memories drift. Not to the grand, forced smiles of corporate galas, but to the sterile, unforgiving white of the Metropolitan Health Center. 6 months ago. A rainy Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday. Evelyn sat in the orthopedic waiting room, the air heavy with the scent of industrial lemon and the quiet desperation of the sick. She was there for a consultation on her knee, a slow, grinding erosion from years of standing quietly by Richard's side at events that meant nothing to her. She looked at her phone. A text from Richard had arrived 3 hours late. Can't make the 2 p.m. Emergency session with the Dubai Group. Logistics issue on the North Shore project. Take a car home. Logistics. Emergency. Investors. These were the bricks Richard used to build a fortress of his ego. To him, a wife's medical appointment was merely an unlisted variable, something that could be moved, delayed, or deleted without affecting the quarterly projections. Across the waiting room, she saw an elderly couple. The man, his hands trembling with age, was gently tucking a strand of hair behind his wife's ear. They were whispering, sharing a private joke that made the woman's tired eyes spark with life. Evelyn felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in her chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was a cold, analytical realization. In the ledger of her marriage, the support column was a hollow 0. She was an asset that provided 100% stability but received 0% maintenance. Number 42, Mrs. Caldwell, the nurse called. Evelyn stood up, her knee clicking painfully. She walked into the examination room alone. She sat on the edge of the paper-covered table, listening to the doctor explain the thinning of her cartilage with the same detached focus she used to analyze a failing insurance portfolio. "Is your husband coming, Evelyn?" the doctor asked, looking at the empty chair in the corner. "This recovery will be difficult without someone to manage the logistics." "I have a system in place," Evelyn replied, her voice as smooth as polished stone. She didn't say, "I have a husband," because at that moment she realized she hadn't had one for years. She had a cohabitant, a ghost in a tailored suit, who mistook her presence for permanence. When she returned home that evening, the penthouse was a tomb of expensive shadows. Richard didn't return until midnight, smelling of expensive scotch and the frantic energy of a closed deal. He didn't ask about the doctor. He didn't ask why she was limping. "It's about precision, Evelyn," he barked, pacing the living room while checking his tablet. "If the data is off by even a fraction, the whole risk profile shifts. People are so incredibly careless with the details." Evelyn watched him from the hallway, her face hidden in the dark. She thought about the details he was missing. She thought about the 0.1% of his attention she had spent 30 years begging for, only to realize that the error wasn't in his data. It was in her expectations. Precision, she thought. "You want precision, Richard? I will give you a lesson in it." That was the night the quiet shift began. She stopped inviting him to her world because he had already evicted himself from it. She realized that by pleading for his time, she was devaluing her own market value. In a corporate merger, when one party stops communicating, the other usually panics. But Richard was too blinded by his own spotlight to notice the lights going out in his own home. He loved the silence because it meant he didn't have to listen to a reality that didn't revolve around him. Evelyn began to use that silence as her laboratory. While Richard slept, she was awake in her study, the screens glowing with the hidden architecture of the Hartwell Family Trust. She began her own audit, not of his company, but of his character. And the risk, she concluded, was far too high to ignore any longer. The empty spaces he left behind weren't holes. They were the very foundations where she was building her exit. In Richard Caldwell's world, everything was categorized. His life was a series of spreadsheets, and every person he met was assigned a specific value. There were Tier 1 assets, the board members, the major institutional investors, and the political lobbyists. Then there were Tier 2 assets, the senior VPs, and the reliable contractors. Evelyn was not even on the list. In Richard's mind, she had become a constant, a background element that required zero maintenance and provided no direct ROI. This became painfully clear during the annual Founders Gala, held just 4 months before the divorce. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and silk gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the frantic energy of networking. Richard was in his element, moving through the crowd like a shark in familiar waters. He held a glass of vintage champagne, his smile practiced and sharp. Evelyn stood by his side, wearing a simple, elegant navy dress. She was there as an accessory, the stable wife who signaled to the investors that Richard was a man of traditional values. Richard, fantastic quarter, a heavy-set man named Miller, a major shareholder, shouted over the music. The North Shore expansion, bold move, risky but bold. Risk is just data that hasn't been managed yet, Miller. Richard replied with a smug grin. He didn't introduce Evelyn. He didn't even glance at her. We've tightened the internal controls. The margins are locked in. And your wife? Miller asked, turning to Evelyn with a polite nod. She must be proud of the empire you're building. Richard laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Evelyn? Oh, she keeps the home fires burning. She has a little consulting hobby to keep her busy, but mostly, she's the reason I don't have to worry about the domestic logistics. She's the ultimate silent partner. A little consulting hobby. Evelyn felt the words like a cold needle. At that very moment, she was under contract with 3 of the top 5 insurance firms in the country, analyzing the catastrophic failure risks of infrastructure projects exactly like the one Richard was bragging about. If she released her latest report on the North Shore project, his locked-in margins would evaporate in a single trading day. But she said nothing. She simply tilted her head and offered a faint, enigmatic smile. I find that in any large-scale operation, the most important variables are often the ones people forget to put on the balance sheet, Evelyn said softly. Miller blinked, looking at her with sudden curiosity. Interesting point, such as? Before Evelyn could answer, Richard's phone vibrated. He didn't even excuse himself. He just stepped away, leaving Evelyn mid-sentence. Excuse me, Miller, it's London. I have to take this. Richard barked into the phone as he walked toward a quieter corner of the room. Evelyn stood there, abandoned in the middle of a conversation. Miller looked embarrassed for her. He's a busy man, Mrs. Caldwell. Big responsibilities. Responsibility is an interesting word, Mr. Miller, Evelyn replied, her voice cool and precise. Most people confuse it with power, but true responsibility is about what you owe to the foundations, not just the facade. She spent the rest of the evening observing. She watched the way Richard's IR manager, Claire Winters, hovered near him, feeding him data points like a bird feeding a predator. She watched the way Richard ignored the fine lines of fatigue on his staff's faces. He was so blinded by the spotlight he had cast on himself that he couldn't see the shadows growing at his feet. As they drove home in the back of the town car that night, Richard was energized, checking the late-night market openings on his tablet. Great night, he muttered. Miller is increasing his position. We're going to be untouchable by next spring. He didn't ask how her evening was. He didn't thank her for coming. He didn't even notice that she hadn't touched her champagne. Richard, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the hum of the electric engine. What is it? I'm reading the London opening. Have you ever wondered what happens to a structure when the foundation stops supporting the weight? Richard didn't look up. That's what engineers are for, Evelyn. Don't worry your head about structural integrity. Just focus on finding a good caterer for the Christmas party. I want to impress the pension fund trustees. Evelyn turned her gaze to the window, watching the city lights blur into long golden streaks. She realized then that Richard didn't just ignore her. He fundamentally believed she was incapable of being a threat. He viewed her as a piece of furniture, necessary but inanimate. It was the perfect cover. By the time they reached the penthouse, Evelyn had already mentally calculated the cost of his arrogance. He was over-leveraged, underprepared, and entirely alone, though he didn't know it yet. He had left her out of his equations for so long that he had forgotten she was the one who held the pen. She wasn't a variable he could ignore anymore. She was the zero that would eventually nullify his entire life's work. If the gala was the moment Evelyn realized her value was a zero in Richard's eyes, the rainy Tuesday in November was the moment she decided to stop being a part of his equation altogether. It was the day of her mother's funeral. The sky over the cemetery was a bruised purple, leaking a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked through even the thickest wool coats. Evelyn stood by the open grave, her black umbrella shielding her from the world. She felt remarkably small, but for the first time in 30 years the fog in her mind had cleared. She looked at the empty space beside her. It was a physical manifestation of Richard's absence. 2 hours ago she had been standing in the foyer of the penthouse, her coat already on. Richard was in his study, the door half open. He was shouting into his headset, his voice bouncing off the minimalist walls. I don't care about the environmental impact report. If the concrete pour is delayed, we lose $5 million a week. Push the inspectors. Offer them a consultation fee if you have to. Evelyn had knocked softly on the doorframe. Richard didn't even turn around. He held up a finger, the universal sign for, wait, I'm doing something important. When he finally ended the call, he looked at her with a mix of confusion and irritation. Why are you dressed like that? We have the merger dinner with the Sterling Group tonight. My mother's funeral is in an hour, Richard, Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the pleading tone she might have used years ago. I told you 3 times this week. Richard blinked. For a split second, a flicker of guilt crossed his face, but it was quickly extinguished by the fire of ambition. He checked his watch. Evelyn, the Sterling dinner is the culmination of 6 months of work. If I'm not there, the whole deal could soften. You know how sensitive these legacy families are. Surely your mother would have understood. She was a businesswoman after all. She was a mother first, Richard. And she was the one who provided the seed capital for your first firm. Do you remember that? Or was that just another logistics detail you've archived? Richard waved his hand dismissively. That was decades ago. It was a loan, and I paid it back with interest. Look, I'll send a massive wreath. The best one they have? And I'll join you at the wake for an hour before the dinner. That's the best I can do. Don't bother, Evelyn had said. As the casket was lowered now, Evelyn didn't cry. Instead, she found herself drifting back to a conversation she'd had with her mother just weeks before the end. Her mother, even in her frailest state, had eyes that were as sharp as diamonds. Evelyn, her mother had whispered, clutching her hand. I kept the trust a secret from Richard because I wanted you to see the man behind the ambition. Silence isn't just a hiding place, my dear. It's an observation deck. You've watched him long enough. You know exactly where the cracks are. I don't want to destroy him, Mother, Evelyn had replied. You aren't destroying him, her mother had said with a faint, knowing smile. You are simply allowing him to face the consequences of the architecture he chose to build. When the time comes, don't use the trust to hurt him. Use it to set yourself free. A cage is still a cage, even if the bars are made of gold. Evelyn looked at the first handful of dirt hitting the polished wood. She wasn't just burying her mother, she was burying the quiet wife. She was burying the woman who accepted being an unlisted variable. That evening, Evelyn returned to the penthouse. The lights were blazing, and the scent of Richard's expensive cologne lingered. He was already at the sterling dinner, charming investors. She went to her private study and locked the door. She didn't take off her damp coat. She opened the hidden drawer and took out the deed for H. Legacy Holdings. She touched the signature, her mother's last gift. It wasn't just a document of wealth, it was a blueprint for an exit. "You said he was a businessman, Richard," Evelyn whispered to the empty room. "Then you should appreciate the cost of a total loss." She picked up her phone and dialed Daniel Rowan. "Daniel, it's time. I want the full forensic audit, and I want the notice of hidden interest ready to file. My mother left me the keys to the kingdom, and I think it's time we changed the locks." The breaking point had passed. The architecture of her marriage had officially collapsed. Now she was ready to build something new. In the world of structural engineering, the most dangerous phase isn't the explosion. It's the creep, the slow, imperceptible deformation of a material under constant stress. For 30 years, Evelyn had been the material under stress. Now, the deformation was complete. She had hardened into something unbreakable. The weeks following her mother's funeral were a masterclass in deception. Evelyn didn't scream, she didn't cry, and she didn't confront Richard about his absence. Instead, she became the perfect version of the woman he thought she was, silent, compliant, and invisible. Every morning she made his coffee exactly the way he liked it. Every evening, she listened to him boast about the Sterling merger. To Richard, her silence was a sign of moving on. He assumed she had accepted her place in his shadow once again. He had no idea that every time she poured his coffee, she was mentally calculating the liquidity of his offshore accounts. "You've been very agreeable lately, Evelyn," Richard said one evening, looking up from his laptop. They were in the living room, the city lights twinkling like cold diamonds behind the glass walls. "I appreciate it. This merger is exhausting, and it's nice to have a quiet house. I've realized that some things aren't worth the breath they take to discuss," Evelyn replied, her voice soft and rhythmic. Richard nodded, satisfied with his own interpretation. "Exactly. Maturity is about knowing what to prioritize." He went back to his screens, oblivious to the fact that Evelyn's priorities had shifted entirely. While Richard focused on the facade, the stock prices, and the media coverage, Evelyn was focused on the forensics. Every night, after Richard retreated to his room or stayed late at the office, Evelyn was in her study with Daniel Rowan, the forensic auditor. They communicated through encrypted channels. Daniel was a man of cold facts, much like Evelyn. "Evelyn, I've found it." Daniel's voice came through the speakers one Tuesday night, sounding like gravel being crushed. "The North Shore project. It's not just risky, it's a shell game. Richard has been moving debt from the main ledger into a subsidiary called Caldwell Infrastructure Beta. He's hiding the interest payments to make the quarterly dividends look higher." Evelyn leaned into the blue light of her monitor. "How much, Daniel?" $80 million. If the auditors find this before the merger closes, the SEC won't just fine him, they'll dismantle him. It's corporate fraud, plain and simple. Evelyn felt a surge of cold satisfaction. It was exactly what she had suspected. Richard's arrogance had led him to believe he was smarter than the system. He thought the rules were for people who didn't have his vision. "Don't leak it yet," Evelyn whispered. "We need the divorce papers served first. I want his focus split. I want him trying to fight me for the house while his empire starts to smoke." "You're playing a dangerous game, Evelyn," Daniel remarked. "If the company collapses too fast, your 51% share in the voting stock might lose its value." "I'm an actuary, Daniel," Evelyn said, her eyes reflecting the complex data on the screen. "I've already factored in the loss. I'd rather own 51% of a ruin than 0% of a lie. Besides, H Legacy Holdings has enough diversified assets to absorb the hit. Richard is the only one who is truly over-leveraged. The next day, Evelyn visited a small, unassuming law office in the suburbs, far away from the high-rise firms Richard frequented. She met with a lawyer who specialized in quiet exits. "I don't want to fight," Evelyn told the lawyer. "I want an execution. Everything is prepared. The forensic report, the trust documents, the proof of H Legacy's ownership. We wait for the snow. He always signs his best deals when it snows." She returned home and found Richard in the kitchen, celebrating with a bottle of champagne. "It's happening, Evelyn. The Sterling board just gave the green light. We signed the final papers in 3 weeks. I'm going to be the largest infrastructure player on the East Coast." He poured her a glass. Evelyn held it but didn't drink. "To the future," she said, her voice steady. "To the future," Richard echoed, his eyes bright with greed. He thought he was at the summit. He didn't realize he was standing on a cornice of snow, and Evelyn had just pulled the pin on the avalanche. The quiet shift was over. The momentum was now entirely on her side. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time as his wife. He was a man built of paper and ego, held together by the very silence she had provided for 30 years. She put the glass down, untouched. "I'm going to bed, Richard. I have a long day tomorrow." "Big plans?" he asked distractedly, already checking his messages. "Yes," Evelyn said, her hand on the doorknob. "I'm finally going to see the view from the other side of the glass." The snow began to fall at dawn, just as Evelyn had predicted. It was a soft, deceptive powder that quickly transformed the city into a white and gray landscape. In Richard's mind, snow was a lucky omen. It reminded him of the day he closed his first $1 million contract. To Evelyn, it was merely the perfect atmospheric backdrop for a clean break. She sat at the mahogany table, the same one where they had hosted countless strategic dinners for people Richard wanted to impress. Now, the table held only 2 things: a single folder and a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen. Richard walked into the dining room, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked energized, the predatory gleam in his eyes sharper than usual. The Sterling merger was days away from being finalized. He felt invincible. "Is it ready?" he asked, not bothering with a greeting. "It is," Evelyn replied. She watched him pull out the chair opposite her, the power seat. Richard flicked open the folder. He skimmed the pages with a practiced eye, looking for the numbers he expected to see. He saw the modest lump sum, the waiver of the penthouse, and the clause stating Evelyn would make no further claims on Caldwell Energy. "I have to say, Evelyn, I'm impressed," Richard said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I thought you'd put up more of a fight for the real estate, but I suppose you realize that maintaining a place like this on a consultant's salary is unrealistic." "I value peace over property, Richard," she said, her voice like silk. "Besides, I've already secured a new arrangement." "Good. Smart," he muttered, reaching for the pen. "I've always said you were a practical woman. That's why we worked for so long. No drama, no emotional tax." He signed his name with a flourish, a large, jagged signature that took up half the page. It was the signature of a man who believed his word was law. He didn't notice that Evelyn was staring not at his face, but at his hands. For 30 years, those hands had built a world that excluded her. Now, they were signing away the only protection he had left. Evelyn picked up the pen. It felt different now. In Chapter 1, this moment felt like an end. But with the knowledge of the H Legacy Trust and the $80 million fraud report sitting on a server waiting for her command, it felt like a launch. She signed her name, Evelyn Hartwell. As she finished the last stroke, she felt a physical weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just signing a divorce. She was signing a release form for the avalanche. "There," Richard said, snapping the folder shut. It's official. You have 30 days, as we discussed. My assistant, Claire, will send over the logistics for the movers. Try not to take anything that belongs to the estate. I'll only take what is truly mine, Evelyn said. Richard stood up, checking his watch, his eternal ritual. I have a board briefing in 30 minutes. We're announcing the preliminary merger growth figures. The market is going to go insane. I'm sure it will be a day to remember, Evelyn remarked, standing up with him. For a brief, flickering second, Richard paused. He looked at Evelyn as if seeing her through a distorted lens. There was something in her eyes, a lack of the usual submissiveness, that made his internal alarm system chirp. But his ego silenced the warning. Well, he said, clearing his throat. Good luck, Evelyn. Truly. Good luck to you too, Richard, she replied. You're going to need it. The weather is turning quite treacherous. He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound, and walked out of the room. The heavy click of the front door echoed like a gavel. Evelyn didn't move. She waited until she heard the elevator doors slide shut. Then she walked to her study and opened her laptop. She opened the secure portal to the H Legacy Holdings dashboard. With a few keystrokes, she activated the disclosure protocol. Immediately, an automated email was sent to Judge Morris's clerk, requesting the formal commencement of the mandatory asset discovery process. In high-value divorces, this was a standard procedure, but Richard had assumed they would bypass it with their private agreement. He didn't know that Evelyn's lawyer had filed a notice of hidden interest 5 minutes after the signing. Next, she sent a one-word message to Daniel Rowan, execute. The snow was falling faster now, blurring the edges of the skyscrapers. From her high vantage point, the world looked quiet and pristine. But beneath that white blanket, the gears of a massive machine were finally beginning to turn in the opposite direction. Richard thought he had just evicted a tenant. He had actually just invited an auditor into his soul. 2 weeks after the signing, the atmosphere in Judge Morris's chambers was thick with the scent of old paper and the hum of a high-end filtration system. It was a sterile, quiet room where lives were dismantled with the stroke of a pen. Outside, the city was still recovering from the heavy snow, but inside, a different kind of frost was settling over the long oak table. Richard Caldwell sat with his legal team, 3 men in identical charcoal suits, their faces masks of practiced indifference. Richard looked bored, checking his gold watch every few minutes. To him, this mandatory asset discovery was a mere formality, an annoying speed bump on his way to the Sterling merger press conference. Let's speed this up, Richard whispered to his lead counsel, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who owned the room. I have a flight to catch at 4. Across from him sat Evelyn. She was alone. No team of expensive lawyers, no frantic assistants. She wore a simple charcoal suit that matched the room's gravity. Her hands were folded on the table, still and steady as a statue. Judge Morris entered, his robes rustling like dry leaves. He sat down and adjusted his spectacles, looking over the primary disclosure file with a weariness that only decades on the bench can provide. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Morris began, his voice a dry rasp. Your team has submitted a statement of net worth totaling approximately $42 million. This includes your equity in Caldwell Energy and your personal real estate holdings. Is this correct? Correct, Your Honor, Richard said, flashing a confident, predatory smile. As per our private agreement, the distribution is settled. My wife is well provided for. We're just here to satisfy the procedural requirements. Indeed, the judge replied. He paused, his eyes shifting to a thick, blue-tabbed folder that had been delivered to his desk only an hour prior. The silence in the room stretched, becoming taut like a wire about to snap. Richard's lead counsel leaned forward, sensing a change in the air. Your Honor, is there an issue? Judge Morris didn't look up. He slowly opened the blue folder. A notice of undisclosed interest was filed by Mrs. Hartwell's representative this morning, along with a certified registry from the International Trust Authority. Richard's smile didn't vanish. It froze. Undisclosed interest? I've been an open book. My IR manager, Claire Winters, has vetted every cent. Then perhaps Miss Winters was unaware of the existence of H Legacy Holdings, Judge Morris said. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. H Legacy, the phantom entity that held the deciding 51% of his company's voting shares. The silent partner he had spent 5 years trying to identify, bribe, or bypass. He felt a sudden, cold sweat break out at the base of his neck. "What does a private holding company have to do with my divorce?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "That's a corporate matter. It has nothing to do with my marital assets." "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice dropping into a chillingly professional register. "According to the verified trust documents, the sole beneficiary and authorized signatory for H Legacy Holdings is Evelyn Hartwell." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard could hear the faint ticking of his own watch, a sound that now seemed to count down the seconds of his remaining power. He turned his head slowly to look at Evelyn. She didn't look away. She didn't smirk. She simply watched him with the clinical detachment of an actuary observing a catastrophic failure in real time. "You?" Richard whispered. The word was a strangled breath. "It's a mistake. You're a consultant for boutique firms. You don't have that kind of... You couldn't have." "I told you once, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel through silk. "Responsibility is about the foundation, not the facade. You obsessed over the height of the towers. I simply made sure I owned the ground they stood on." "There's more," Judge Morris interrupted, his voice like a gavel. "Mrs. Hartwell has also submitted a forensic audit report, compiled by Daniel Rowan. It details an $80 million discrepancy in the Caldwell Infrastructure Beta subsidiary. Reclassified debt, hidden interest payments." Richard's lead lawyer was frantically flipping through a binder, his hands shaking. The air in the room seemed to have been sucked out. "The Sterling merger is built on a hollow pylon." "Richard." Evelyn continued, her gaze unwavering. "And as the majority voting shareholder, I cannot allow a fraudulent transaction to proceed under my family's legacy. I've already instructed the board to halt all proceedings. The SEC has been notified." Richard tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of water. He sank back into the plush leather chair, the very chair he thought was his throne, and watched as his entire world dissolved into a sea of red ink and broken promises. "You've destroyed it," Richard wheezed. "You've destroyed everything I built." "No, Richard," Evelyn said, standing up and picking up her portfolio with practiced grace. "I've just completed the audit, and it turns out you were already bankrupt. I'm just the one who finally published the report." Judge Morris looked at the broken man and the silent architect. "This court is recessed. Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you find a different set of lawyers. You aren't in a divorce hearing anymore. You're in a crime scene." Evelyn walked out of the chambers, her footsteps echoing with a steady, certain rhythm. Behind her, the room erupted into a chaos of panicked whispers, but she didn't look back. The revelation was complete. The structure had fallen. The heavy oak doors of the judge's chambers swung shut, but the silence in the marble corridor was even more suffocating. Richard stumbled out, his expensive leather briefcase hanging loosely from his hand like a dead weight. His legal team was huddled a few feet away, their voices a frantic, low-pitched buzz of mitigation, plea deals, and damage control. To them, he was no longer a titan. He was a toxic asset. Evelyn was already halfway to the elevators. She walked with a steady, rhythmic pace, not the gait of a victor, but the measured step of someone who had cleared a long-standing debt. "Evelyn, wait!" Richard's voice cracked. He ran a few steps, his polished shoes skidding on the marble floor. He grabbed her sleeve, but Evelyn stopped and looked at his hand with such icy neutrality that he immediately let go, as if burned by the sheer coldness of her gaze. "Why?" Richard gasped. His face was a mottled, sickly red. 30 years, Evelyn. We lived together for 3 decades. I thought I knew every corner of your mind. I thought you were content. A quiet fixture in my house. Evelyn turned to face him fully. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse caught the silver in her hair, making her look like a statue carved from moonlight. "You didn't know me, Richard, because you never bothered to look at the data points that didn't serve your ego," she said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the heat he expected. Anger would have been a comfort to him. It would have meant she still felt something. This was worse. This was an unspoken assessment finally delivered. Legacy. "That was your mother's, wasn't it?" Richard asked, his eyes darting around as he tried to piece together the shattered puzzle of his reality. "The faceless bureaucrats I spent millions trying to track down. The shareholders who refused to be bought. It was you? All those times I complained to you over dinner about those stubborn ghosts. You were sitting right there, passing me the wine." "I was," Evelyn replied. "And every time you spoke about crushing them, you were providing me with a real-time risk report of your own character. You viewed power as a tool for elimination. I viewed it as a calculated patience, a way to preserve what was truly valuable." "You lied to me," he hissed, a spark of his old arrogance flickering in his eyes. "For 30 years, you lived a lie." "No, Richard. I practiced a disciplined silence. There is a profound statistical difference," Evelyn corrected him, her tone clinical. "I didn't hide the truth. I simply stopped offering it to someone who had no capacity to value it. You assumed my silence was a lack of intelligence. You mistook my endurance for a lack of ambition. That was your analytical error, not my deception." Richard leaned against the cold stone wall, the weight of his own architecture finally crushing him. The Sterling merger was a corpse. His reputation was a fractured pylon. "What now?" he whispered. "You've stripped me of everything. The company, the house, the name. What is left?" "What is left is the reality you spent 30 years trying to ignore," Evelyn said. She stepped closer, her presence suddenly overwhelming. "You think this was an act of revenge, but as a risk consultant, I find revenge to be an inefficient use of energy. It clouds the judgment." She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a small, printed graph, the final audit of his legacy. "I did this because you became a systemic risk," she continued. "To the thousands of employees you over-leveraged, to the investors you lied to, and to the legacy my mother entrusted to me. You were a bridge with a fatal flaw, Richard. I didn't push you. I just stopped providing the invisible support you refused to acknowledge." "I could have changed," Richard pleaded, "if you had just given me a warning." "I gave you 30 years of warnings," Evelyn said, her voice softening but staying firm. "At the hospital, at the funeral, in every quiet evening you spent talking at me instead of with me. Today wasn't a surprise, Richard. It was a structural inevitability." The elevator chimed, a clean mechanical sound that signaled the end of their era. The doors slid open with a soft sigh. Evelyn stepped inside and turned to face him. As the doors began to close, she offered him one last piece of professional advice. "The 30 days I gave you to vacate, consider it a grace period for your soul. Use it to learn how to live in a world where the ledger isn't rigged in your favor. Because from now on, Richard, you're the only asset you have left to manage. And I'm afraid the market value is quite low." The doors shut. Richard was left alone in the corridor, the silence finally becoming the one thing he couldn't ignore. The 72 hours following the courthouse revelation were a study in kinetic energy. Richard Caldwell, stripped of his boardroom throne, did exactly what a cornered predator does. He tried to burn the forest to hide his trail. By the next morning, whispers had evolved into frantic headlines. Richard's remaining PR machine, a few loyalists and paid consultants, began leaking a desperate narrative. They painted Evelyn as a vengeful shadow, a silent saboteur who had weaponized a hidden inheritance to dismantle one of the city's vital infrastructure giants. "She is holding our city's future hostage for a personal vendetta," Richard shouted during an impromptu interview outside his club. His tie was loosened, his eyes bloodshot. A rare, jagged crack in his carefully curated facade. "Caldwell Energy is an engine of progress. I will not let a bitter woman stall that engine because her feelings were hurt." Inside her new office, a serene, light-filled sanctuary overlooking a quiet park, Evelyn watched the broadcast on mute. The flickering images of Richard's rage felt like distant lightning from a storm she had already bypassed. "He's playing the emotional woman card," Daniel Rowan observed, leaning against the window frame. "He's trying to trigger a force majeure clause in the Sterling contract to bypass your voting bloc. He wants the public to see you as a risk, not him. He's forgetting a fundamental law of physics, Daniel," Evelyn said, her eyes calm and clear. "In a gale, the tallest towers create the most wind resistance. I'm not a force of nature. I'm just the corrective gravity that was always there." She turned to Claire Winters, who sat nearby. Claire, once Richard's most trusted shadow, now held a folder that contained the company's true soul. "Claire," Evelyn said softly, "you spent years polishing his lies. Are you ready to publish the truth? Not for me, but for the integrity of the ledger." Claire nodded, her expression one of newfound clarity. "I have the encrypted logs, Evelyn. Every instruction he gave to reclassify the North Shore debt. I thought I was being a loyal soldier. I didn't realize I was just guarding a crime scene." Evelyn didn't call a press conference. She didn't counter-leak stories about Richard's coldness or his infidelities. Instead, she invited the lead investigators from the SEC and the head of the Sterling Group's audit committee to a private, documented briefing. In the very boardroom Richard had once ruled, Evelyn laid out the evidence. It wasn't a story of a broken marriage. It was a map of corporate decay. "Richard Caldwell believes a company is an extension of his ego," Evelyn told the regulators, her voice resonating with an unshakable authority. "But a company is a social contract. When he moved $80 million in liabilities to an unlisted subsidiary, he didn't just break a rule. He poisoned the foundation of our sector." She didn't show photos of her mother's grave. She showed them the spreadsheets. She showed them the emails Claire had provided. And finally, she showed them the Hartwell restoration plan, a strategy to use her private capital to stabilize the firm, protect the employees' pensions, and settle the fines Richard had incurred. "You're offering to personally guarantee the firm's stability?" the lead auditor asked, stunned. "Most people would just let it burn and walk away with the insurance." "I am a risk consultant," Evelyn replied. "The highest risk to this city is a collapsed energy grid. I'm not saving Richard. I'm removing the rot so the structure can finally breathe." By sunset, the tide had turned. The Sterling Group released a definitive statement. The merger was canceled not because of a vengeful wife, but due to uncovered systemic fraud. Richard's final friction had failed. The harder he pushed against the truth, the faster the truth pushed back. That evening, a final text arrived from him. "You really did have it all planned, didn't you?" Evelyn didn't reply. She simply deleted the thread and closed the file. In her world, the variable had been successfully neutralized. 30 days. In Richard's narrow world, 30 days was the time it took to evict a tenant. In Evelyn's world, it was the exact time frame required for a complete structural restoration. The penthouse was silent now, stripped of the artificial prestige Richard had spent decades curating. The minimalist furniture, the cold marble floors, the expansive glass walls, everything that once served as a monument to his ego was now just a hollow shell. The movers had taken only what Evelyn called her essential assets: her mother's oak desk, her collection of vintage journals, and the small framed photographs of a life lived before the silence became a cage. She left the rest. The designer rugs and the hollow art belonged to a life that had finally been amortized to zero. Evelyn stood in the center of the vast living room, her wool coat buttoned against the winter chill. She looked at the ghost of the mahogany dining table, the spot where the signatures were exchanged, where her silence had been her only loyal companion. Her phone buzzed with a final notification. Richard Caldwell had officially signed a global settlement. He was barred from the financial sector for life. His personal assets had been liquidated to cover a fraction of his debts. He hadn't just lost his company, he had lost the very ground he thought he had conquered. Evelyn walked to the window. Below, the city was moving. The lights of the infrastructure Richard once claimed to own were flickering to life, powered now by a board that answered to H. Legacy. Under the new, ethical management she had installed, the company's stock was beginning a slow, healthy recovery. It wasn't the aggressive growth Richard had craved, it was sustainable equilibrium. The last of the crates are in the van, Mrs. Hartwell? Evelyn turned to see Daniel Rowan. For the first time, he wasn't staring at a screen. He looked remarkably relaxed. "The final audit is complete then?" Evelyn asked. "The numbers are balanced," Daniel replied. "The hidden debts are settled, the pensions are secured, and H. Legacy has regained its liquidity. From a purely mathematical standpoint, the system is at peace." "Peace," Evelyn repeated. "A beautiful concept. What's next for you, Beatrice?" "Tano, oh no. The board is practically begging you to take the chairmanship. They're terrified of another rounding error without you." Evelyn offered a small, genuine smile. "I'm an actuary, Daniel. My job isn't to build the towers, it's to ensure they don't fall on the people inside. I've done my work here. I think I'll spend some time in the garden my mother left me. I've spent too many years analyzing other people's risks. It's time I enjoyed the security of my own." She took one last look at the penthouse. She didn't feel triumph. She felt only the profound relief a pilot feels when a damaged aircraft finally touches down on a stable, sunlit runway. She walked out and pulled the heavy door shut. The click of the lock was soft, final, and perfectly precise. Evelyn drove herself to her new home, a quiet, stone-built cottage on the edge of the city, shielded by a canopy of ancient oaks. It was a house with a solid foundation and no glass ceilings. That evening, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the wind through the branches. No shouting into headsets, no clinking of networking glasses, no oppressive silence born of neglect. This was the sound of a life that had been properly audited and approved for future use. She opened her laptop one last time. She didn't check the markets. Instead, she opened a fresh, blank spreadsheet. At the very top, she typed, "Life after risk." She listed her new variables: reading, travel, peace, time, the probability of failure, 0.0%, the expected return, immeasurable. Evelyn Hartwell, the silent architect, closed her laptop and watched the stars. For the first time in 30 years, she wasn't calculating the distance to the ground. She was simply enjoying the height. The file was closed. The restructuring was complete.